A person arrives at the emergency room exhausted, dehydrated, confused, and sometimes on the verge of collapse. When the doctor sees them, they don't give them a miracle pill, nor do they talk about hormones or genes. What they do is give them an IV, water and salt, injecting it directly into their vein. But at first, they don't do anything else. And yet, after a while, something surprising happens. The person's blood pressure stabilizes, their head clears, and their body recovers. This is something that has always fascinated me when I see it. Because if water were only useful for hydration as we were told in school, what I just described to you, it would make no sense at all. If water only served to fill a tank, in other words, if you just drank it to refill your body's reservoir, why can such a simple act bring someone back from the brink of death? Well, I can promise you, if water were just a simple liquid, as you probably still genuinely believe, this entire video would absolutely not exist at all. And here comes the first uncomfortable question, the one that almost no one asks. Why? Why does the body respond this way to something so basic? The answer hides another one of the pervasive great myths we've been repeatedly told throughout our lives, from childhood onward. Saying that water is only for hydration is probably the biggest lie of all. All the basic biological education you've probably received. It's like saying electricity is only good for turning on a light bulb. And yes, it turns on the light, it lights the bulb, but it also moves trains, keeps hospitals running, and makes your brain work. In other words, thinking that water is only for hydration isn't just serious because it's false. What's more, it's serious because it's incredibly incomplete. So incomplete that for many hundreds of years, it's something that has kept us from truly understanding how our body really works. In the same way that electricity sustains the functioning of our entire modern civilization, water does too. But with one big difference. You already knew about electricity, but the truth about water had been kept from you. Well, today I will truly endeavor to put a definitive end to all that, let's call it elegantly, rather incomplete and somewhat misleading information. The human body, as your own experience probably tells you, is not a tank that just gets filled up. In other words, we are not a jug with a water level that goes up and down. We are a living system, and we use water to organize, to move, and to transmit energy. You probably didn't know this, but today, if you watch the video until the end, you'll understand it clearly. When that happens, everything you thought you knew about that fatigue you sometimes carry around, about the inflammation you feel that never goes away, and about that loss of vitality, it will start to make sense to you from a different perspective. Let's start with the very fundamental basics, because the key, as always, is right there. And the problem most of the time isn't that you're lacking water. The problem is that the water in your body, the water you drink, the water you take in, is no longer doing its job. And why isn't it doing its job? And I hear you. I can imagine what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, but what do you mean it's not doing its job? I mean, I've been drinking water my whole life, and here I am. And you'll say to me, you're driving me crazy, Jose Maria. And it's normal for you to think that, but look at the surprise I'm about to give you. In a few minutes, you're going to understand why this molecule, water, doesn't just hydrate, and why it behaves like a true biological battery in your body. And you'll also understand why what I just told you isn't some minor detail. In fact, it will completely change the way you understand your energy from now on. But for that, we first have to dismantle that comfortable idea that was put into our heads. And here is the first trap. When we say that water hydrates us, we all think of H₂O, 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, a simple neutral liquid and the great solvent of minerals. Think of a river and how the stones end up. It's true, but that truth is incomplete. Because if drinking H₂O were the only key, I, however, could tell you without any risk of being wrong that if you drink 3 liters of purified water or chlorinated water, in other words, purified or chlorinated H₂O, you're not doing it right. And in fact, you're dehydrating yourself. Yes, you heard that right. Even though you're drinking those 3 liters, you're dehydrating yourself. Why? It's very simple. Because the body doesn't just need volume. You're not a jug. Above all, it needs conductivity. It needs wires to conduct that electricity. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the body works thanks to electricity and biochemistry. But for both, water is essential. And if the water you drink doesn't contain the basic minerals that allow for conductivity, I'm talking about the electrolytes we discussed in the previous video, then what you're drinking is dead water. And that's why for your neurological system and your body to function perfectly, what your biology especially needs are those minerals, those electrolytes. And that's why, remember or think about it, men who cross the desert always carry salts, and camels lick salt stones before setting out to keep themselves mineralized. Because water alone cleanses you, but if you don't add salts, besides cleaning you, it also takes away your own minerals and your charge. And the more of that water you drink, the more you'll wash your body, the more you'll dissolve your minerals, and the more dehydrated you'll become. So, to debunk the lie, we have to look at water not just as the solvent H₂O. And so you can really understand and absorb this, as I was saying, we have to break down that convenient idea they put in our heads. And to truly break it down, we really have to look at water, not merely as H₂O, but rather as a dynamic living structure that inherently carries an electrical charge. What does it mean, a living structure that carries a charge? It means we're not talking about the liquid H₂O, but about something that in science is called the 4th phase of water, or easy water. And how is that water formed? Well, your cells and proteins are like surfaces that love water. They're called hydrophilic surfaces. When water touches these surfaces as it moves through your body, it is forced to self-organize. In other words, it stacks up and becomes more viscous. And most importantly, it acquires a negative charge. And you might ask me, how does it get that charge? Well, here's the big secret: through exclusion. Structured water, when it forms next to the surface of your cells, has, pay attention to what I'm about to say, the ability to expel protons from its interior. What do I mean by that? I'm referring to the positively charged hydrogen ions that are in the internal environment. You studied all of this in school. Try to jog your memory a bit. Well, the structured water that has formed pushes those protons out into the rest of the liquid. Think of it as the creation of a biological battery. The layer attached to the cell, which is that water transformed by the expulsion of protons, is what's called structured water or easy water. As I was telling you, it's water that is no longer H₂O, it has transformed and is now H₃O₂. It takes on a different form, and this happens because it arranges itself into a hexagonal structure. And it's this unique shape that allows it to store extra energy in the form of electrons. This is impressive, and you might ask, if this one is hexagonal, what was the shape of H₂O? The H₂O one? Very good question. H₂O has a completely disordered structure. It's as if when you open the doors of a packed football stadium, instead of the crowd leaving chaotically, which would be like H₂O, they exit in rows, perfectly organized. That's H₃O₂. It's precisely that radical change to a hexagonal structure which makes it possible for this water to be called structured water, as I was saying, H₃O₂. And this H₃O₂, what happens in this process is that it ends up with an excess of negative charge. It expelled the protons, it expelled its positive components. And what is the biochemical consequence of having done that? Well, this layer of H₃O₂ water becomes the negative pole of your battery, and the surrounding liquid, in other words the rest of the water that is not attached to the cell, gets filled with the expelled protons and ends up with an excess of positive charge. It becomes the positive pole of your battery. Now you have both of them. This simple act of charge separation is the key. And this, scientifically, is what is called an electrochemical gradient. Well, you have just created the two poles of a battery, the negative side and the positive side. Unfair. This process is what turns that water, now H₃O₂, into a true biological battery, capable of storing potential energy and generating movement without relying on an external motor. And with this, I've arrived at a piece of information that is going to surprise you. First, how much of the water inside your body becomes H₃O₂? Most of it. You see, an important scientist whom I'll talk about later. In this video, Gerald Pollack suggests that H₃O₂ water is not the exception, but in fact the rule. A large portion of the water molecules in your body are no longer just liquid H₂O, the regular water like the kind you drink. They are a structure that has become a living and charged structure. In fact, if you were to witness the dissection of a recently deceased person or the opening of a living person in an operating room, during an operation, what you would be able to see would serve as the best proof of what I'm telling you. If you want, ask your surgeon friend. Well, once you understand this, you'll realize that it makes perfect sense to say that we've spent decades looking at the key to life in the wrong way. For years, we were taught to think about water in a very simple way. Too simple, in fact. And they told us, if you're thirsty, drink. If you're tired, drink more. If you have a headache, maybe what's happening is that you're lacking water. And so we got used to a very convenient idea that water goes in, the body manages that amount of water, and there's nothing else to think about. But there's something here that doesn't add up. If water were only for hydration, if it were just a liquid that fills up spaces, then it shouldn't really matter what kind of water you drink. When you drink it, or what state your body is in when you drink it. And yet it does matter. In fact, it matters a lot. You see, there are people who hydrate perfectly according to the manual, the one they explained to us, and yet they still feel tired. They still have brain fog or still lack energy. Does this sound familiar to you? If this is indeed happening to you, it's most probably because you've been trying to fill the tank, perhaps something like one small glass after another, when in actual reality, we're truly talking about a significant problem that occurs at a very microscopic level and is primarily focused on what we could accurately call the need for wiring. Wiring? Yes, wiring. Stay with me and you'll understand. And there's also something even stranger. In the hospital, when someone is really unwell, as I was saying, they don't give them tap water. They don't just give them any bottle, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video. They give them water with an exact proportion of salts, a very specific structure, and they also do it directly, meaning that water is injected straight into the bloodstream. Well, the reasoning behind all of this is that your body isn't waiting for a volume of water. What your body really needs above all, and I've told you this many times, is conductance. It's the famous wires, or rather the electrolytes, as we've discussed today and in a previous video. And this is important because if you don't understand this difference, everything that comes next will seem absurd to you. Well, this is where that old idea starts to fall apart. The human body doesn't work like an empty glass. You fill it up and that's it. It functions much like an intricate network of literally millions of tiny microscopic spaces where the essential water, your precious drinking water, has to perform an incredible engineering feat. And this, in particular, is truly the hardest thing for us to fully accept because, quite frankly, it was never adequately explained to us in this particular way. Inside the body, water is not still. It's neither neutral nor passive, and honestly, it's astonishing. The water inside the body is constantly interacting with proteins, membranes, tissues, and electrical charges. Did you hear that clearly? Yes, it's interacting, it's not passive. And when that interaction changes, everything else changes. The energy, the movement, the signal. That's why there are people who often feel that they don't have enough energy, even if they eat well, sleep, or exercise. And this isn't because they are completely lacking in essential fuel. It's that the entire intricate system that should be efficiently moving that vital fuel simply isn't functioning or operating as effectively as it truly should be. Now here comes a truly key inquiry again that I genuinely want you to let thoughtfully linger in your mind for a while. What if the problem isn't actually the amount of water itself, but simply the way the body organizes the water? If that's truly the case, then talking about accelerated aging, persistent chronic fatigue, widespread inflammation, or any other significant manifestation isn't just about our genetic predispositions and hormonal fluctuations. It's fundamentally about internal order, a profound and essential internal order. And here I am going to pause for a brief moment, and I am doing this quite deliberately and entirely on purpose. Because if I gave you the name of the scientist and the formula right now, your mind would probably dismiss it, thinking, ugh, this is a crazy theory. That wouldn't be a good idea on my part. First, I need, as I've already told you several times, for the old idea you have in your head to completely fall away. When you start to accept that water isn't just filler, in other words, liquid that goes in and nothing more, but that what enters your body is actually a true structure, then yes, then I think you'll be ready to learn about the idea. The most fascinating idea in modern biology. Water is not just a liquid. It's not just a means of transport, and it's not just filler either. When you understand and accept this, you will have taken a step you'll never forget for the rest of your life. And why is that? It's very simple and straightforward, because you will have thoroughly understood the fundamental reasons that comprehensively explain precisely why water can indeed behave like a powerful battery, why the human body can effortlessly generate significant movement without any external pushing, and why so many things we currently call failures today are actually just natural consequences of a complex system that isn't properly and completely ordered in all its intricate parts. It's fascinating. Well, that's what we're going to look at now. And let me give you a little preview. What I'm telling you isn't some crazy theory. It's not just a pretty metaphor, no. This is something that has been observed, measured, and repeated in laboratories for years. But no one has told you about it. Let's get to it. To understand what's coming next, I need you to do something very simple. For a moment, try to forget about the glass of water. Forget about the water bottle. Forget about still water or simply the water you know. Because inside the body, water doesn't behave like the water you see on the table. Forget about that one. For years, a scientist named Gerald Pollack, a biophysicist at the University of Washington in the United States, started asking himself a question that many people thought was absurd. And he would say, what if water, when it's in contact with living surfaces, doesn't behave the way we think it does? And Pollack wasn't a guru, nor was he an outsider. He was a classic laboratory researcher who simply started, thank you, to look at water under a microscope in very specific conditions. And what he observed was that when water is in contact with certain surfaces, membranes, proteins, or tissues, it stops being disordered. The disordered H₂O I mentioned becomes organized. Like I said before, imagine that stadium full of people leaving a soccer match. Everyone is moving around without order, H₂O. And that would be normal water. Now imagine that someone simply stands at the door and starts lining everyone up so they all leave facing the same direction. Suddenly, order appears, and that's what Pollack observed. He discovered a zone of structured water, the one that's attached to surfaces, which doesn't mix with the rest. It has different properties and is also electrically charged. He called this zone, as I mentioned before, the exclusion zone, or simply easy water exclusion zone. And not because the water he discovered was magical, but because it's water that excludes particles and behaves in a way different from the water we know. Just think about the marvel of what happens inside our bodies. And here comes the key point. That structured water is not only more ordered, but also, as I've told you several times, it has an electric charge. And when there's a charge, that means there's potential energy. Which, by the way, is a basic principle of physics. Pollack explained it in a very simple way. He said that this water works like a battery. And if this is indeed true, it profoundly and radically changes the fundamental way we truly understand the human body. And the reality is that it doesn't work the way we've been told, and now we're going to make it concrete. I'm not referring to a battery like lithium batteries. I'm talking about a biological cell capable of separating stored charges, storing them, and generating movement. And this is where many pieces start to fit together. Because you see, if the human body is full of microscopic surfaces, membranes, fibers, capillaries, then it's full of places where water can organize itself in that way, because water reaches everywhere. And if water organizes itself like that, then it turns out the body no longer depends solely on pushing liquids with pressure. It turns out the body can move things on its own using that energy, which is stored in the water. Do you realize how important this is? But it didn't stop there. Pollack observed something else, and this is going to blow your mind. That water structure forms even better when it receives external energy, especially infrared light. The same light that the sun emits, the same light, by the way, that your own body emits. In other words, the energy in our body doesn't just come in through fuel, which in our case would be food converted into ATP. Energy also enters through light and is converted into voltage or movement potential within the water. That is, light charges the battery so that ATP can be used and then distributed. I know all of this is complicated, I understand. And I also understand that this is probably something very new and surprising for you. Let's just slow down a little bit and think very calmly for a moment. If water can store energy, if it can organize itself, if it can generate movement, then the human body is no longer just a chemical engine that burns fuel from the food we eat. It becomes an electrohydraulic system. Think of an engine that not only burns fuel, that is chemistry, but also uses charged water to generate flow and movement. If that's the case, we're no longer talking about chemistry. I'm talking about real electricity and hydraulic movement. And all of this happens at the same time. And this profoundly changes a great many things, because it fundamentally changes how we truly understand the complex phenomenon of fatigue and how we also understand the intricate process of aging. As I was saying, the human body is no longer just a chemical engine that burns fuel. Let me give you a specific example. Because it changes how you might come to understand why sometimes all your test results are fine, and yet you feel terrible. Because perhaps the fundamental problem isn't truly what you are currently lacking, but rather precisely how all of your vital energy is thoughtfully organized and distributed deep inside you. For decades, this idea remained on the margins, not because it was false, but because it didn't fit well into a model that explained everything through chemical reactions. But biology isn't just chemistry, it's also structure. And where there is structure, there is function. Think of it this way. Chemistry is the fuel. Remember the famous ATPs. Structure, that is ordered, easy water, is the engine and the wiring. And function is the flow and the signal that this bioelectric wiring makes possible. This efficiency is key for your mitochondria. If cellular water is structured, ATP production is much more efficient. Aging is in part becoming dehydrated at this level of molecular structure. In other words, it's not functioning properly. And you may have noticed sometimes that on the opposite end, you're more electric. Paper sticks to your fingertips, your hair might even stand up, or when you touch your car door, you get a little shock. Well, that's actually a real gift for your body. It means you're doing things very well. Your body is like a battery when it's fully charged. The light that they're able to produce is at its maximum. If the intricate structure fails, that is to say, if it completely loses its inherent order and its vital electrical charge, the inevitable consequence is that the entire body then has to laboriously push the system forward and consequently starts consuming an excessively large amount of precious fuel, once again ATP, and is ultimately forced to do so simply to adequately compensate for the profound failure. That has occurred with the wiring. In short, that forced consumption is a waste. And that's why what I'm telling you doesn't replace classical biochemistry, it simply expands on it. Classical biochemistry explains the what, that is, what reactions take place. And bioelectricity explains the how, that is, how that process is organized with maximum efficiency. And now comes the uncomfortable part. If water can do all this, if it can generate flow and movement, then we have to ask ourselves a very serious question. Because accepting this forces us to reconsider one of the most sacred ideas in physiology. Do we truly and genuinely believe that the entire complex circulatory system depends solely and exclusively on a simple mechanical pump? Because if water effectively works, if water powerfully pushes, and if water inherently stores vital energy, then the heart cannot possibly be the whole, complete story. And that's exactly where we're headed. Let's see now. Throughout almost all our education, we were told a very simple story. So simple that it seemed indisputable. In fact, it has been until now. The heart is a pump. It pushes the blood. The blood circulates, and thanks to that, we live. That's what we were told. And yes, of course, the heart beats, and of course, it generates pressure. No one is denying that. I'm not denying that. Here comes the question that almost no one ever asks. Do you truly believe that a single pump by itself can effectively move vital blood through the vast expanse of tens of thousands of kilometers of incredibly microscopic capillary vessels, which are even thinner than a human hair? And can it accomplish this remarkable feat for an astonishing 80 or even 90 continuous years without experiencing any catastrophic breakdowns or causing irreparable damage to everything? If the entire system were solely about immense pressure, if it were merely just pushing relentlessly from its very center, the resulting wear and tear would undoubtedly be absolutely brutal. And yet, the system is extraordinarily efficient. This is precisely where the entire story truly starts to dramatically change. The circulatory system doesn't work like a hose that you just pump pressure into, so it keeps moving. It works like a living network where the flow is maintained thanks to gradients, elasticity, and distributed movement. And here, water comes into play again. If water can organize itself, store energy, and generate movement in those capillaries, then it turns out that the flow doesn't depend solely on the push from the heart. It depends on the medium being well organized. It's like a river. Think about a river. A river doesn't flow because someone is pushing the water from behind. It flows because there is a slope, structure, and continuity. When the riverbed is clear, the water flows on its own. When the riverbed is damaged or dirty, no matter how hard you push, you can't get it to flow well. Well, this is where many things start to make sense. Ask yourself, why are there people with an apparently healthy heart but poor circulation? Why is there chronic fatigue without there being a failure, without any obvious heart failure? Or why does the blood become thick, the pressure rise, and the tissues end up without oxygen? Because the problem isn't always with the pump, it's with the medium through which it moves. And this is where many people start to understand why they do everything right and still don't get better. In other words, the heart doesn't disappear from the model, it simply stops being the only main character. Look at how the news is. For years, some researchers and also some intuitive observers had already pointed this out. People like Rudolf Steiner or Victor Schauberger. They spoke about flow, about natural movement, about how living systems don't operate through brute force. They didn't possess modern, advanced microscopes, nor could they accurately measure electrical charges, but even so, they intuitively sensed something profoundly essential. Life doesn't push, life truly flows. Nowadays, with much more modern tools, we're starting to see that this intuition wasn't so far off. When water loses its structure, when the internal environment becomes disordered, then the body has to compensate for that disorder with pressure, and that's when problems begin. More pressure, more effort, more wear and tear. And not because the heart is failing, but because what it's doing is trying to sustain a system that no longer flows as it should. Do you realize the shift in perspective? It's truly impressive. And here now comes an important idea that I truly want you to keep deeply engraved in your mind. In the body, health doesn't just depend on pushing harder. It depends on allowing things to flow. And when the environment is right, movement happens with much less effort. And when the environment is wrong, everything becomes forced. And now that you've understood this, now that we no longer see the body as a machine of pistons, but as a system of flow, an intelligent one, now we're ready to take the next step. Because if the environment is everything, and if water and the internal environment make the difference, then the question is no longer which part needs to be changed. If not, then what are the conditions that need to be restored? And that leads us directly to a fascinating story that happened more than 100 years ago. At the beginning of the 20th century, long before anyone talked about genes, chronic inflammation, or molecular biology, there was a man who asked a very different question. This Frenchman was named René Quinton. Quinton noticed something that still makes us uncomfortable today. Many diseases didn't seem to be isolated failures, but rather consequences of a deteriorated internal environment. While the medicine of his time was searching for which organ was broken, what he did was ask himself something much simpler. He would say, what if the problem isn't with the parts themselves, but with the environment in which these parts live? Quinton started from a basic observation. He thought life began in the ocean. And even though we've left it, in reality, our internal environment still maintains a surprising similarity to seawater. Blood plasma, that is the liquid that bathes our cells, has a composition that is extraordinarily similar to the primitive ocean. And from there, Quinton formulated an idea so simple it seemed naive. He said if cells live in an environment and that environment deteriorates, the cells become ill. But they don't get sick because they're defective. Rather, it's because they can't function properly since it's the environment that's defective. And to explain it, he used a metaphor that is still perfect today. He said that the body is like an aquarium. If a fish gets sick, you can try to medicate it, you can even move it to another place, you can isolate it. But if the aquarium water is dirty, if the oxygen is low, if the salinity isn't right, the fish, all of them, will keep getting sick. The real solution isn't to chase after the fish, it's to fix the water. Quinton wasn't trying to cure diseases as we understand it today. What he was doing was trying to restore living conditions inside the body. And it wasn't just a theory, he proved it. And he proved it many times. His dispensaries in Paris at the beginning of the 20th century became extremely famous, and he documented the treatment and recovery of thousands of people. During times of typhus and cholera epidemics, and with babies dying from malnutrition, he demonstrated that by restoring the quality of that internal aquarium of the body would recover in remarkable ways. Thank you. Astonishing. And this completely changes our perspective. Now we can stop seeing the body as a defective enemy and start seeing it as a system that is trying to survive in an environment that no longer supports it. And here I want us to briefly pause just for a moment once again. You, please, connect what I just told you with everything we've seen so far. If water can truly organize itself, if it can effectively store vital energy, if it can readily facilitate essential flow, then the internal environment is not merely a secondary detail, it is in fact the fundamental stage where absolutely everything profoundly happens. And when that stage deteriorates, the only thing the body can do is adapt. It compensates. It pushes, it gets stronger, and for a while it works. But there comes a point when compensating is no longer enough. There comes a time when the heart can no longer keep pumping because it doesn't have enough strength. And that's when fatigue, inflammation, and loss of vitality appear. And not because the body is making a mistake, but because it's trying to live in an environment that no longer allows it to function properly. This way of understanding biology is profoundly different from what we were taught. And it's not an aggressive approach, nor is it punitive, nor does it go against the body. No, what it does is support the context. And what is the context, you might ask? Well, it's very simple. It's the internal environment. It's the water we've talked about. It's the order and the electrical charge that allows everything to flow. When you support the context, you stop medicating the sick fish and focus on restoring the conditions so that the aquarium can clean itself. And that, even though it sounds simple, is one of the most revolutionary ideas you can understand about your health. Because if the environment is everything, if the water and the internal environment are the foundation of how things work, then the inevitable question is this: what everyday things in our modern lives are significantly damaging the environment without us even truly realizing it? Perhaps even more importantly, what exactly can we effectively do to stop sabotaging our own efforts in the future? Our internal environment, and that's exactly what we're going to look at now. But not to add things to your life, rather to simply stop ruining what is already working. And at this point, once again, an almost automatic question usually comes up. I can almost picture it in your head. You might say, okay, I understand everything you just told me, but now, what am I supposed to do with all this new information? Well, this is where I want us to be very clear, because this is not a video of recipes. It's not a video with miracle lists, and it's not a video to add even more things to your life. No, it's a video to help you stop sabotaging the battery that you already know you have inside your body. And if the body works like a battery, if water organizes energy, if the internal environment is everything, then the right question is not what supplement to add, or what new technique to try, or what trend to follow. No, the question is even more uncomfortable, and it's what things do I do every day that drain that battery without me even realizing it? Look carefully at the significant journey we've traveled up to this point. We've seen that water is not just volume but structure, that this structure can store energy, and that the flow in the body doesn't just depend on pushing but on how the medium is organized. We've also seen that when this medium degrades, the body tries to compensate until it simply can't anymore. And that many of the things we call failures are actually nothing more than attempts to survive in poor conditions. Now, allow me to calmly try to bring a bit of order, or to help that order emerge. First fundamental idea: charge is light. Energy, as I mentioned, doesn't just come from fuel, ATP. This is often hard to accept because we've been taught with that premise. But it turns out that the body also gets charged by the voltage of light, by movement, by contact with the environment, and by its internal state. A body that lives shut away, disconnected from day and night, with constant artificial light, is a body that inevitably loses its rhythm. And not because it lacks fuel, but because it doesn't receive the natural signals that help organize water. Second idea: water needs conductivity. Drinking water doesn't guarantee anything if the internal environment is depleted. The body needs minerals, it needs gradients, it needs conduction, and not just for hydration, but so that the signal can circulate. When everything gets diluted, when everything becomes flat, energy doesn't move well. Electrolytes, remember the electrolytes. Third idea: food organizes, but it doesn't just nourish. Plants, fruits, and living foods don't just provide calories, they also provide organized water, already structured, and biological matrices, which the body recognizes and knows how to use. A body that feeds only on dead things can survive, but it struggles to maintain the structure and electrical charge of its internal water. Fourth idea: the environment matters more than you think because it stabilizes the charge. The body didn't evolve in offices or in front of screens nor in closed environments all day with lights and flashes and so on. Being in contact with nature, with the ground, with the air, isn't just romanticism, it's basic physiology. And not because the earth has special powers, but because the body regulates itself better when it stabilizes its electric field through contact with the ground. Walk barefoot on the ground, on the earth. Fifth idea, your internal state changes your physiology. And what I just told you is not philosophy, nor biology, nor a cheap phrase. If you are under constant stress, in a state of permanent alert, sustained fear, what you're doing is altering the signal. And not because thoughts are magical, but because what they do is change your chemistry, your nervous tone, and your internal environment. A body at war does not organize its energy well. And here I want you to remember something very important again. None of this is about doing more. It's about stopping interference. Most people aren't tired because they're missing something. They're tired because they're draining their battery all day long without realizing it. Too many stimuli, too much hurry, and too much electrical disconnection. When you truly understand this profound concept, when you completely stop looking for the ultimate solution outside of yourself, something truly interesting and quite remarkable starts to genuinely happen. Your body, when it stops being sabotaged, starts to reorganize itself on its own. Obviously, it's not from one day to the next, and it's not magical, but it does it in a steady way, because biology doesn't need miracles. What it needs are the right conditions. That's why, the next time you come across a bottle in the store claiming to be structured water, remember, they're deceiving you. The body doesn't receive structure from the outside, the body creates it. And the most efficient way to drink easy water is through eating raw vegetables and fruits, as I mentioned before. But don't look for structured water in a store or inject it into yourself. Become a factory of structured water yourself. And now that you've seen that water is structure, and that flow doesn't depend solely on the heart, and that health is a matter of internal order, now we're ready to take the final step in this video, because energy isn't just for performance. It's for something much more serious, because energy by itself is not the ultimate goal. It's for not depending on others and for being able to reclaim your personal sovereignty so you don't collapse in order to stay standing. And that's what brings us to the end of the video. At this point, there's something I want to make very clear to you, because otherwise everything we've discussed could actually be misunderstood. Energy, as I was saying, is not the goal. We're not talking about energy to run faster, to produce more, or to squeeze yourself harder. No, we're talking about energy so you don't collapse. So you don't depend on chronic fatigue, external stimuli, or fear. We're talking about the essential energy to keep you standing strong when life inevitably gets tough, which of course it always will at some point. To think clearly, to make crucial decisions without fear, because when the body regains its inherent ability to regulate itself simply by stopping sabotaging it, and if, in addition, you restore the structure and the electrical charge of the internal environment, then the need to force the system disappears, and therefore the symptoms of being subjected to excessive effort disappear. That fear goes away. Well, throughout this whole series, we've been dismantling a very old idea, the idea that the body fails. First, we saw that aging doesn't start on the outside, but rather it begins on the inside. And we saw how chronic inflammation is not an accident, but simply an overwhelmed system. We saw how when brakes are missing, the body ends up attacking itself. And today you've seen something else. You've seen that the body's energy doesn't depend only on what you eat. It depends on how water is organized, on how that internal environment flows, and on how order is maintained. Because when order is lost, everything becomes forced. However, when that order is restored, many things start to fall into place without creating tension from within your body. Yeah, this is where a word appears that is almost never used when we talk about biology. Dignity. Dignity is not a moral idea, it's not something aesthetic, it's not a matter of willpower, it's pure biology. A body with dignity is a body that can regulate itself, that doesn't live in a state of emergency, constant, that doesn't need to compensate all the time. A body with dignity is a body that doesn't depend on external stimuli to sustain itself. It's a body that doesn't live on the edge or isn't constantly shutting down and turning back on. And it's important to say this calmly and with composure. It's not about living more years at any cost. It's about living better and knowing what we need to do to achieve that, making as few mistakes as possible, though we will make some. It's about living without fear, with focus, and with the ability to think clearly like we did when we were 30. It's about being able to remember who you are and not becoming a burden, neither to others nor to yourself. Everything we've talked about today, the water, the flow, the energy, the environment, doesn't point to any trick. It simply points to a change in perspective, to stop fighting against your body and just start understanding it, to stop forcing things, and to truly start paying much more careful attention to diligently keeping that vital energy battery alive and fully charged, which you now profoundly know you genuinely possess, so that neither chronic inflammation nor overwhelming fatigue ever becomes an insurmountable obstacle for you in your daily life. And now I want to close with something very simple. If you understand water, you understand energy. If you understand energy, you understand regulation. And when you understand regulation, you understand something much bigger, that your body is not your enemy, it's your ally. But only when you stop putting it at war. In the next video, we're going to go one step further. We're going to talk about how to rebuild a life after years of wear and tear, about what it really means to regain sovereignty over your body and over your time. Because longevity, as I was saying, isn't about extending your life. It's about learning to live the life you have to the fullest and being able to enjoy it with your loved ones. As I always tell you, always go forward and always forward. Remember, and I'll read your comments.